65 degrees. Wyatt Calder stared at the thermometer on his table, then closed his worn leather notebook. He didn't need to record anything else. The house had won. Outside, the February blizzard of 1886 was entering its 8th day. It was no longer just a storm. It was an erasure. Roofs were gone. Chimneys were buried. The mountain pass had vanished. Ashen Fork Valley was a white tomb. Yet, 47 feet above the deadly freeze, Madman's Ledge stood untouched beneath a sandstone overhang. Inside, the silence was heavy. Eleanor, his wife, stirred a pot of hot soup. Their daughter Lila slept deeply under a wool blanket. The dog Huckle lay curled beside her, one ear twitching now and then in his sleep. A damp towel hung by the thermal bench was already bone dry. No rushing, no desperation. The wind clawing at the window glass belonged to a different world. Wyatt stepped closer to the pane. He looked down into the blinding white abyss. Down there were neighbors, families, and children. Down there were the people who had laughed at him. The profound warmth of his own home suddenly felt like a cruel contrast, forcing a chilling question into his mind. How many down there were still breathing? 2 years earlier, Ashen Fork Valley had looked full of promise. New buildings were rising. Freight wagons rolled through the mountain pass almost daily. Men talked about timber, mining claims, and future profits. Among the newcomers was Wyatt Calder, a railroad tunnel mason who had spent years cutting through mountains with hammer, drill, and powder. Stone was familiar to him. So were lode paths, hidden weaknesses, and the quiet warnings found in a crack that most people never noticed. While others searched for parcels along the valley floor, Wyatt studied the terrain itself. He walked ridgelines. He measured slopes. He watched how snow from previous winters still lingered in shaded pockets. Most people saw steep cliffs and wasted ground. His eyes kept returning to the sandstone walls above the settlement. There was something up there that the valley below did not have. Height, protection, and possibilities few others seemed willing to consider. Those possibilities eventually led him to a single, barren shelf of rock. The parcel sat on a narrow bench carved into the cliff face above Ashen Fork Valley. Nobody wanted it. The trail leading to it was steep. There was no level ground for farming. Building there looked difficult, expensive, and unnecessary. That was why the claim cost only $7. The clerk at the land office stared at the paperwork, then looked back at Wyatt. A grin slowly spread across his face. "Planning to live up there?" he asked. Wyatt nodded once. The clerk laughed. By sunset, half the valley had heard the story. By the following week, nearly everyone had an opinion. Most thought the idea was foolish. A few called it dangerous. Several wondered how long it would take before Wyatt brought Eleanor and young Lila back down to safer ground. Silas Whitcomb owned the largest sawmill in Ashen Fork Valley. By 1884, he was also the wealthiest man for 50 miles in any direction. Most of that wealth came from timber. Every new roof, wall, porch, and barn put money in his pocket. At the edge of town, crews were already raising a large boarding house that would serve travelers, merchants, and visiting investors. When finished, the project would cost nearly $3,900. People admired it. Silas made sure they did. The story of Wyatt's cliff claim reached him before the first shovel touched the ground. He laughed harder than anyone. One afternoon, while a group of townsmen gathered outside the general store, Silas pointed toward the sandstone wall above the valley. "That place," he said, "looks more like a perch than a home." The men chuckled. Silas shook his head. "They'll call it Madman's Ledge soon enough after the first winter proves me right." The name caught on quickly. Within days, it was no longer Wyatt's project. People simply referred to it as Madman's Ledge. In Ashen Fork, $7 had purchased the cheapest piece of land in the valley, and, according to local opinion, the worst. Trips into town became more difficult for Eleanor than she expected. Whenever she entered the mercantile, conversation seemed to shift. Smiles appeared for a moment, then disappeared just as quickly. Adeline Whitcomb, the wife of Silas Whitcomb, rarely said anything openly cruel. She did not have to. An empty chair at a table could send the same message. So could a gaze quickly averted as she walked by. Lila noticed it too. Children who once waved now stayed close to their parents. That evening, as supper cooked over the fire, Eleanor quietly described the day. Wyatt listened. He asked no one for an apology. He offered no defense of his plans. Instead, after the meal, he stepped outside with a notebook and a measuring stick. The setting sun cast long shadows across the cliff face. He marked another angle and recorded another observation. Far below, the lights of Ashen Fork flickered to life. Above them, the sandstone remained silent. So did Wyatt. Construction began in the spring of 1884 and continued through every season that followed. The cliff did not surrender easily. Each room had to be earned. Every foot of progress came from hammer blows, careful measurements, and long days spent shaping stone one piece at a time. Wyatt started before sunrise most mornings. The sound of steel striking sandstone became as familiar to the valley as birdsong. Chips of rock scattered across the ledge, while dust drifted from the growing opening in the cliff face. The work moved slowly. That was exactly how he wanted it. Years spent inside railroad tunnels had taught him that rushing stone usually meant fixing mistakes later. Pepper hauled loads up the steep trail day after day. Timber for lintels, lime for mortar, iron hinges, mica panes for the windows. The mule never moved quickly, but it never stopped moving either. Eleanor carried her share of the burden. She mixed mortar in wooden troughs and helped fit stones where the entrance met the cliff. By midsummer, her hands looked more like those of a builder than a former schoolteacher. Lila found her own jobs. She gathered loose fragments of sandstone into small piles. Sometimes she sorted them by color, sometimes by size. The piles rarely served any practical purpose. But Wyatt never told her to stop. To him, the work belonged to the whole family. Huckle followed everyone. The dog inspected every new corner of the ledge as if he had been appointed foreman of the project. More than once, he stretched out across the entrance and refused to move until someone stepped around him. By autumn, the outline of a home had begun to emerge from the cliff itself. A sheltered entrance appeared first, then a main room, then a sleeping space. Storage niches followed. Visitors occasionally climbed the trail to see the strange project for themselves. Most left shaking their heads. From the valley floor, it still looked impossible. From the ledge, however, something different was taking shape. The house did not seem built onto the mountain. It looked as though it had always been there, waiting beneath the stone until someone finally uncovered it. As the months passed, the shape of the home became easier to recognize. The reasons behind it did not. People climbing the trail often asked Wyatt what he was building. Most received the same response, a polite nod, a brief reply, then he quietly returned to work. Lila asked far more questions than any visitor. Unlike the adults, she never asked whether the house would succeed. She only wanted to know why each part looked different from the houses below. One afternoon she pointed toward the broad shelf of stone hanging above the entrance. "What is that for?" Wyatt glanced upward. "Rain." That was all he said. The rock brow extended several feet beyond the doorway. Summer storms rolled across the mountains from time to time, but very little water ever reached the entrance. A week later, Lila noticed the narrow passage leading inside. Most homes opened directly into a room. This one did not. Why the extra doorway? Wind. The airlock entry created a small buffer space before anyone entered the living area. Another day she watched him shaping a long stone bench against the inner wall. What about that? Heat. The bench sat where afternoon sunlight could reach it through the windows. Wyatt spent extra time smoothing its surface. Nothing about it looked accidental. Water received the same attention. A shallow groove ran along parts of the ledge outside. Anyone else might have overlooked it. Wyatt did not. The channel guided runoff away from the entrance and toward the edge of the cliff. Even the smoke vent followed an unusual path. Instead of rising straight upward, it turned before reaching the outside air. Lila frowned when she first saw it. Wouldn't a straight one be easier? It would. A few moments later, Wyatt added another sentence. Easier doesn't always mean better. The answer seemed to satisfy her. By the time winter approached, every feature had found its place. Stone, air, water, heat, none of them were treated as enemies. Each one had been given a direction, a path, or a purpose. The house revealed those choices quietly. Anyone willing to look closely could see them. The first serious test arrived before winter. For 3 days, cold rain swept across the mountains without stopping. Water poured down the sandstone walls and raced across the ledges above Ashen Fork Valley. Wyatt spent most of the storm outside, not working, watching. He followed the movement of every stream and every trickle. Some flowed toward the entrance. Then they curved away. The drainage groove carried the runoff exactly where it was supposed to go. Inside, the floor remained dry. The doorway stayed clear. Eleanor placed a bucket near the entrance out of habit. By the 3rd day, she realized it was not needed. That evening, Wyatt recorded rainfall, wind direction, and the condition of the interior floor. Nothing more. The result pleased him, but only slightly. One successful storm meant very little. The mountains still had an entire winter waiting. The first winter brought a problem Wyatt had not expected. It began with something small. One morning, Eleanor picked up a wool towel hanging near the sleeping area and noticed it still felt damp. The following day, the same thing happened again. A week later, she found tiny beads of moisture along one corner of Lila's bed. The room was warm, the roof was sound, nothing leaked. Yet water kept appearing. Eleanor showed him the damp fabric without saying much. Wyatt examined it, then looked toward the stone wall nearby. He offered no explanation. Over the next 3 nights, he treated the problem the same way he would have approached a crack in a tunnel. He observed first. A candle helped reveal the movement of air. A thermometer recorded temperatures at different points in the room. Small strips of cloth were placed in several locations to compare moisture levels. By the 3rd evening, a pattern emerged. The coldest section of stone sat behind the corner where moisture appeared most often. Warm interior air drifted toward that surface, cooled, and released water before it could escape. The discovery bothered him more than the damp towel itself. Months of careful planning had still left a flaw. The cliff home worked, just not as well as he believed. For the first time since construction began, Wyatt found himself studying his own work the same way he once studied a damaged tunnel wall. Not with pride, with suspicion. The solution started the following morning. Instead of defending the design, Wyatt reached for his tools. Part of the interior wall covering came down first, then sections of shelving. Lila watched from across the room, confused. The house had taken more than a year to build. Seeing her father remove pieces of it seemed almost wrong. Eleanor never questioned the decision. She simply helped wherever needed. A deeper cold sump was dug near the lowest section of the floor. Another drainage channel was added where moisture tended to collect. Lila's bed moved farther from the problem wall. Wyatt stretched a heavy wool curtain several inches away from the stone surface, creating a pocket of still air between the two. The drying rack was raised higher into the warmest part of the room. After that, he waited. Measurements continued. One day passed, then another. At the end of the first week, the towel dried noticeably faster. By the second week, the damp corner near Lila's bed remained dry. The tiny droplets that had worried Eleanor were gone. Nothing about the improvement felt dramatic. No celebration followed, just a few new entries and a house that performed a little better than it had before. For Wyatt, that was enough. With those refinements in place, the second winter arrived with far less uncertainty. Still, Wyatt maintained his routine of checking the thermometer each morning. The notebook grew thicker with hard numbers regarding fuel consumption and heat retention. Facts simply replaced assumptions. One afternoon, Amos Reddick, a longtime carpenter from the valley, climbed the trail to see the place for himself. He carefully inspected the walls, the entryway, and the vent. Eventually, his attention settled on the notebook. Wyatt handed it over without a word. Amos spent several minutes turning the pages. When he finally looked up, the old skepticism was gone. Something else had replaced it. It wasn't agreement just yet, but the laughter that once followed the project had completely disappeared. The figures spoke more clearly than arguments ever could. By late autumn of 1885, small changes began appearing across the mountains. Most people barely noticed them. Wyatt did. A herd of elk moved into lower country weeks earlier than usual. Squirrels seemed restless, carrying food from dawn until dusk. The first hard frost arrived ahead of schedule, and before October had ended, thin bands of snow already clung to the northern slopes. The wind felt different as well. Cold currents from the north arrived more often and stayed longer. One afternoon, an aging trapper passed through Ashen Fork on his way south. He stopped near the general store, looked toward the peaks, and remained silent for several moments. Finally, he spoke. "The mountain's getting ready for something." Nobody asked what he meant. A few men chuckled and returned to their business. By the following morning, the remark had already been forgotten by most of the valley. Wyatt remembered it. Over the next several weeks, he quietly began his preparations. The storage spaces inside the cliff home slowly filled. Nothing about it seemed urgent or panicked. Yet, with every deliberate action, the line between mere caution and quiet readiness became much easier to see. As winter drew closer, two very different plans for the future were taking shape in Ashen Fork Valley. Silas Whitcomb continued pouring money into his boarding house. New lumber arrived almost every week from his sawmill. Crews expanded the upper floor. Additional rooms were added beneath a freshly framed attic. Larger windows were ordered to make the building appear more impressive to travelers passing through the valley. The project attracted attention exactly as Silas intended. Visitors stopped to admire it. Investors asked questions. Prospective merchants took notice. To Silas, growth meant opportunity. A larger building meant more guests. More guests meant more business. Every improvement seemed like a sensible investment in the valley's future. The possibility of a severe winter barely entered the conversation. Snow came every year. Spring always followed. That was how most people saw it. Several miles away, Wyatt spent his money differently. Another shipment of flour arrived before the first heavy snow. Barrels of dried beans joined the supplies already stacked against the stone walls. Extra lamp oil filled a storage niche near the rear chamber. When a merchant offered a good price on cured pork, Wyatt bought more than he immediately needed. The purchases drew little attention because they were not visible from the street. No one admired shelves filled with food. No one stopped to praise a storage room. Yet both men were investing in what they believed would matter most. Silas invested in expansion. Wyatt invested in endurance. Neither considered himself reckless. Neither believed he was making a mistake. The difference lay in what each man expected the future to demand from him. And before long, the mountains would offer an answer neither one could ignore. February arrived with snow, which was hardly unusual for Ashen Fork Valley. The first day passed without concern. Wagons still moved along the freight road. Smoke rose from chimneys. Men worked in the sawmill. The Whitcomb boarding house remained busy with travelers escaping the cold. But the snow didn't stop. It only grew heavier, settling over the valley with a quiet, relentless intensity. People noticed it, but few worried. Mountain winters had always been unpredictable. Soon, however, conversations began to change. The snowfall showed no sign of weakening. Fresh drifts covered fences that had stood clear only a day earlier. Wind pushed through the valley with increasing force, carving long ridges across roads and open ground. Something else had changed as well. The storm no longer moved through the mountains. It had settled over them. Morning arrived. Then evening, then another morning. The clock continued forward. The storm did not. High above the valley, shelves inside the cliff home remained full. Firewood stayed dry beneath the overhang. For nearly 2 years, Wyatt had been preparing for conditions exactly like these. Now the mountains were preparing to deliver their verdict. As the blizzard ground on, Ashen Fork Valley began disappearing. The freight road vanished first. Massive drifts swallowed the mountain pass, severing the route completely. The outside world might as well have been 1,000 miles away. No supplies could arrive. No one could leave. The storm had closed every door. Conditions worsened as smaller homes near the valley floor started sinking into the drifts. Windows disappeared. Front doors became tunnels carved through heavy snow. People worked for hours just to keep pathways open, but the deadliest threat emerged when the chimneys began failing. Heavy snow sealed the openings from above, while wind forced smoke back down the flues and into living spaces. Families had to choose between opening doors to clear the air and immediately losing precious heat, or keeping them shut and choking on smoke. Neither choice felt safe. Across Ashen Fork, fear spread faster than the storm itself. Meanwhile, 47 feet above the valley floor, smoke continued leaving Wyatt's home through the dogleg vent exactly as intended. The wind struck the cliff. The vent remained clear. The fire continued to burn. And below, the valley tightened beneath a growing weight of snow. By the 7th day, the Whitcomb boarding house was fighting a battle it had never been designed to face. Snow pressed against the structure from every direction. The weight above continued to grow with each passing hour. Just after midnight, a section of the roof finally gave way. The sound echoed through the building like a gunshot. Guests rushed from their rooms. Lamps swung wildly. Snow spilled through the opening and onto the floor below. Repairs were impossible. The storm still controlled everything outside. Day 8 proved even worse. A long crack appeared along the north wall. At first it seemed harmless. Then it widened. Wood groaned. Glass shattered. Cold air poured through gaps that had not existed the day before. Silas gathered his family and retreated to the kitchen, the strongest room in the building. There they waited. His youngest son had developed a cough during the storm. Each hour it sounded harsher. The stove burned constantly, yet the room felt colder than it should have. For the first time since arriving in Ashen Fork, Silas stopped thinking about investments, property, or expansion. None of those things could hold up a wall. None of them could stop the temperature from falling. As another crack spread across the timber frame, a realization settled over him with frightening clarity. Everything he had spent years building could disappear before morning. While the valley struggled beneath the storm, life inside the cliff home followed a different rhythm. The fire burned steadily. A wool towel hanging near the drying rack felt warm and completely dry when Eleanor folded it away. Huckle slept beside Lila's bed, occasionally lifting his head when the wind struck the cliff outside. The thermal bench still held the afternoon's warmth. Even after sunset, its stone surface remained comfortable to the touch. Nothing there happened by accident. The rock brow continued deflecting snow away from the entrance. The airlock passage reduced the drafts that plagued homes below. The deeper cold sump carried unwanted moisture away from the living space. The wool curtain Wyatt had installed weeks earlier trapped a pocket of still air where condensation once formed. Small improvements. Quiet improvements. Yet each one now carried part of the load. Wyatt stood by the narrow window, listening to the muffled howl of the wind. The steady draw of the chimney and the deep warmth of the stone told the entire story. The house had held. Across the room, Lila slept peacefully, unaware of how different the night felt elsewhere in the valley. Eleanor joined him at the glass. Beyond it lay nothing but darkness, snow, and buried homes. She stood beside him quietly. "There are children down there," she said. The words hung in the room for several seconds. Wyatt remained silent, his gaze fixed on the white abyss below. No further explanation was necessary. The storm had finished testing the house. Something else was about to begin. Sometime during the night, the wind finally weakened. By dawn, the terrible roar that had dominated the valley for 8 straight days had faded into silence. The storm was over. The damage remained. Wyatt was already preparing before the first sunlight touched the cliffs. A coil of hemp rope rested near the entrance. The snow probe leaned against the wall. Several sled planks waited beside the trail. Eleanor packed blankets, water, and food into canvas sacks. No discussion was needed. Both knew exactly where the day would lead. Huckle was the first one outside. The dog moved cautiously across the hardened snow, stopping often to test the air. The valley looked unfamiliar. Homes had become rounded white mounds. Fences had vanished. Entire streets no longer existed. In many places, only a chimney tip hinted that a family might still be trapped below. The first rescue came before noon. Huckle suddenly stopped near what appeared to be an ordinary drift. His ears lifted. Then he began pawing at the snow. Wyatt dropped to one knee and listened. Nothing. Then he noticed something else, a faint smell of smoke, barely detectable. The probe struck wood several feet below the surface. The Baker family was alive. For nearly 3 hours, Wyatt and Eleanor dug through packed snow that felt more like ice than powder. Every shovelful seemed to reveal another layer beneath it. At last, a small opening appeared. A frightened voice answered from below. By sunset, 4 exhausted people emerged into daylight for the first time in over a week. The next morning began the same way. More searching, more digging, more waiting. More waiting. The work stretched across 3 days. Some rescues took an hour. Others required half a day. Families were found inside buried homes, root cellars, and storage sheds. A few survived because neighbors had shared food before the storm arrived. Others endured simply because they refused to quit. When darkness fell on the 3rd evening, 11 people had been pulled from the snow. 18 more found shelter inside the cliff home. Every available space was used. Blankets covered the floor. Children slept beside the thermal bench. Meals were stretched carefully. No one complained. The place that had once been mocked throughout Ashen Fork had become the safest location in the entire valley. The name Madman's Ledge still existed. It simply meant something different now. Silas Whitcomb was among the last survivors Wyatt found. Part of the boarding house remained visible above the snow, but much of the structure had collapsed inward. Silas and his family had taken refuge inside the kitchen. The room was freezing. The fire had nearly died. His youngest son barely had the strength to speak. When Wyatt finally broke through the drift blocking the doorway, Silas stared at him in disbelief. Neither man spoke for several moments. There was nothing left to argue about. Hours later, after a slow climb through deep snow, Silas stopped halfway up the trail and looked toward the home perched beneath the sandstone overhang. The sight was almost painful. The windows remained intact. Smoke rose steadily from the vent. Light glowed from inside. For 2 years he had laughed at that place. Now his family was alive because it existed. The mountain had delivered its judgment. and the answer stood quietly above the valley for everyone to see. Spring arrived slowly in Ashen Fork Valley. Long after the storm had ended, great walls of snow still stood in the shadows of the mountains. As the temperatures gradually rose and the snow receded, the true cost of those 8 days became clear. 5 graves appeared on a hillside overlooking the valley. 5 families had lost someone during the storm. No rebuilding effort could change that. Yet the number might have been far worse. The survivors knew it. The 18 people who had shared the cliff home knew it most of all. As spring continued, conversations across Ashen Fork began to change. For nearly 2 years, people had discussed Wyatt Calder's project as though it were a curiosity. Now they discussed it as a lesson. One evening, a community gathering was held near the damaged remains of the boarding house. Much of the structure could still be repaired, but the scars left by the storm remained visible. Silas Whitcomb stood before a crowd that included neighbors, merchants, laborers, and families he had known for years. The valley's wealthiest man looked older than he had before the blizzard. The winter had taken something from him, not property, certainty. For a moment he stared toward the cliff above town. Then he spoke. "When that house was being built, I thought I understood what made a place strong." The crowd remained silent. I was wrong. No one laughed. No one argued. There was too much evidence scattered across the valley. The damaged buildings below and the intact home above had already settled the debate. Several people turned toward Wyatt. He offered no speech, no victory lap. Instead, he stepped forward carrying the same worn notebook that had accompanied him through every season of construction. The leather cover showed years of use. Pages were stained from rain, dust, and work. Wyatt placed it on a table. Anyone who wished to see it was free to do so. Inside were temperatures, fuel records, vent observations, moisture measurements, mistakes, corrections, storm notes, nothing hidden, nothing exaggerated. The notebook contained the entire story, one observation at a time. People crowded around it for hours. Many arrived expecting secrets. Most left with a different understanding. The house had not survived because of luck. It had survived because hundreds of small decisions worked together. Some of those decisions had even come from failures. The damp corner near Lila's bed, the condensation problem, the redesigned airflow, the deeper cold sump, the additional drainage channel. Every correction mattered. Summer eventually returned to the valley. Then another winter passed. Then another. 3 years after the blizzard, Ashen Fork looked different. Several homes had been built against sheltered rock faces. Storage rooms appeared beneath stone overhangs. New structures paid closer attention to drainage, airflow, and elevation. People still used timber. They simply used it differently. Even Silas changed. The boarding house was rebuilt, but not in the same way. Part of his investment went towards something few would have imagined years earlier. A community storm room was carved into a sandstone outcrop near town. When asked why, he usually smiled and gave the same answer. The mountain already taught that lesson once. Time continued forward. Lila grew older. The little girl who once sorted piles of sandstone became a young woman who knew how to read weather, identify drainage paths, and understand why a wall should face one direction instead of another. Huckle eventually slowed with age. Pepper carried fewer loads. The valley changed. The mountains did not. Years later, a short inscription appeared near the entrance of the cliff home. The words were simple. Stone waits. Men learn. Decades passed. Blizzards still arrived from the north. Snow still buried roads. Wind still searched for weaknesses. The mountains never stopped testing those who lived among them. Yet the home beneath the sandstone overhang remained. Visitors occasionally climbed the trail to see it. Some admired the craftsmanship, others admired the view. A few stood quietly beside the weathered stone and thought about the winter of 1886. The lesson left behind was not really about a house, nor was it about winning an argument. The mountain had never cared about opinions. It responded only to preparation, observation, and respect. That truth had been written in snow once, then it was written in stone. And both records endured.